Hello, everyone. Good evening in Beijing. Good morning on the States side. My name is Rusty Fufunan. I am a graduate of Yale College, class of 2024, a current Yale Light Fellow at Middlebury in Beijing, and an intern here at Yale Center Beijing. For those of you who are new, Yale Center Beijing was founded in 2014 as Yale's embassy and activity center in China, serving all of its 14 schools. For the past 10 plus years, we have hosted thousands of events, such as today's, convening thought leaders to discuss critical and cutting-edge issues that are shaping our world. Today, I am delighted to welcome Professor Stephen Darwall, Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. A fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2001, Professor Darwall has written broadly on fundamental moral philosophy, moral psychology, and the history of ethics. His most well-known book is The Second Person Standpoint: Morality, Respect, and Accountability. And his most recent books are Modern Moral Philosophy, from Grotius to Kant, and The Heart and Its Attitudes, the subject of today's lecture. In this talk, Professor Darwall will explore attitudes of the heart, such as remorse, love, trust, gratitude, personal anger, and jealousy, and their role in mediating personal relationship, attachment, and connection. He also examines how these heartfelt attitudes mirror attitudes of the will, guilt, resentment, and blame. Professor Darwall will begin with a short presentation, and we invite our audience to turn on their video cameras if you can. It always makes for a more engaging lecture. And after the lecture portion, we will open the floor for a Q&A session. Without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to Professor Darwall.
Yeah, this is titled A Philosophical Journey from Mind to Heart. And the book in question, The Heart and Its Attitudes, you see it there in the image. I should say that the cover for it was designed by my wife, Laura Radwell, who in many ways is the inspiration for this book and helped me to see a lot of things that I finally figured out at the advanced stage of something in my 70s. Okay, so it's Philosophical Journey from Mind to Heart. I start the book in the preface by talking about a little bit about my background. My mother was a paranoid schizophrenic, and so I lived the early part of my life trying to figure things out and trying desperately to understand the world, which could be a sort of frightening place for me. And I also grew up with a distinct lack of love, which sort of dogged me throughout much of my life. And this book really it's a philosophical book, no question about that. But the themes that I'm writing about are themes, very personal themes, and they're hard-won themes, things that took me a long time to figure out and to learn. So my initial thrust in the world was just to understand things, to use my head, to use my mind. And most of my early philosophical work was about the foundations of morality, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But what this book is about is a heartfelt connection. Yeah, so here you have an image of Peter Strawson. This is a photo that was taken by Simon Blackburn, who's a very well-known philosopher. And Strawson wrote this paper in 1962 called Freedom and Resentment. And it's probably one of two most influential philosophical articles of the second half of the 20th century, at least in English. And it's certainly the inspiration for a lot of my work. So Strawson wrote about what he called reactive attitudes. Reactive attitudes sound much worse than they actually are because we think about reactivity and getting your buttons pushed and so on. But really what Strawson was about here is a certain way of engaging others with our attitudes. These are attitudes that we hold, as Strawson put it, from a participant stance, a participant in a relationship. It's what I call the second person stance, but more about that in a moment. And he gave various examples. They're what we call deontic examples. Deontic is a word meaning duty. So these are attitudes that are involved in our judgments of right, wrong, rights, wronging, um, and culpability. And the examples are resentment, blame, or what he called indignation, and guilt. But he also gave non-deontic examples, ones that didn't involve duty at all. He talked about gratitude, love, forgiveness, and hurt feelings. Hurt feelings, I think, is especially interesting. When you have hurt feelings, that doesn't mean like you've stubbed your toe. It means that you've been hurt in your heart. Uh, so I wanted to understand what heart is and what attitudes of the heart are and how they mediate heartfelt connection. All reactive attitudes are held, again, from what Strawson called a participant stance, as opposed to an objective stance. Now, what's the difference here? Well, participant stance is what I call the second person perspective. Excuse me. Um, and that's the perspective we have when we are implicitly addressing someone else. I mean, you and I right now are in the second person perspective with respect to each other. You know, we can look to our right and to our left, and we see someone over there, and we have a third person perspective or observer's perspective on them. But the moment we start to talk to them, then we're in a second person perspective. Second person here means like you, the grammatical second person, not second party. So you can have a second personal attitude towards yourself, and guilt is a great example of that. We'll be talking more about guilt later. Guilt is the feeling of being accountable. You implicitly address yourself and you say, Steve, you really shouldn't have done that. You need to take responsibility for that. Okay, so this is a book that I published in 2006. Um, and I was making a lot of use of Strawson's ideas in this book. And I was providing, I argued, a foundation for morality, something I'd been thinking about certainly since I was an undergraduate at Yale, but even before that. Uh, so, what I'm calling deontic reactive attitudes, blame, guilt, resentment, these attitudes mediate mutual accountability. We hold others accountable through the attitude, or we hold ourselves accountable through the attitude, as, for example, with guilt. In general, deontic reactive attitudes are, first, essentially interpersonal. That's Strawson's term. I say second personal. It's the same thing. Secondly, they implicitly make a demand on the agent. So they say, in effect, you must do this. Um, but it's not a coercive demand. It's not attempting to force the other. It's a putatively legitimate demand. And so they address the other as a free will, not as someone to be pushed around. They therefore presuppose the legitimacy of the demand. That is, that there's the authority to make the demand. And finally, they bid for an acknowledgement of this authority and for the agent to hold themselves accountable. They come with what I call an RSVP. So here's an example I like to use to illustrate. So these are two Italian ice dancers in the Winter Olympics years ago in Torino. And it's Maurizio Margaglio, he's the male, and Barbara Fusarpoli, who later became the skating coach for Italy, is the woman. And they're very close to a medal in the ice dancing competition, but Maurizio drops Barbara Fusarpoli and they fall to the ice. And they're on the ice for a good long time. And then after an agonizing time, they get up and she looks at him. And then she really looks at him. Now, that's what I would call a second personal look. It's as if she's saying to him, Maurizio, tell me what happened. Look me in the eye and tell me how you dropped me. And here's another gift to sort of illustrate it. It's eyes on eyes. So you're not looking at the other person, you're looking to the other person to engage them, have them look back to you and to give an account of what they were doing, what they did. So they hold the other accountable. So you can see the you, you, what what happened. Okay. So In implicitly addressing putatively legitimate demands or expectations, deontic reactive attitudes are, I say, an expression of will to another will. So they make a demand, that's what I will or would have you do, and they address the other as a will, someone who freely did something and needs to take accountability for it, a responsibility for it. So they imply what I would call a will to will relation. And so, again, just to recall, the deontic reactive attitudes are attitudes like blame, resentment, guilt. Okay. They presuppose what I would call a reciprocity of right. That is, that we're mutually accountable to one another. I have the standing to hold you accountable. You likewise have the standing to hold me accountable. So we are in a reciprocal relationship of right. We are obligated to one another, and we have to be able to justify ourselves to one another. By contrast, the non-deontic reactive attitudes I'll be discussing, they don't presuppose expectations at all. You can't expect someone to love you. You can't expect someone to trust you. To the contrary, you can just hope that they will. You can invite them to, and they always involve a heartfelt expression, what I would call an opening of one's heart to another heart that invites reciprocation and hopes for it. They imply what I call a heart-to-heart relation rather than the will-to-will relation that's being implied by the deontic examples. So since they implicitly relate to another in a heartfelt way, I say they are second personal attitudes of the heart. So both the deontic examples and the non-deontic examples are second personal in the sense that they implicitly address the other. They don't simply have the other as an object in the way, for example, contempt might. Um, they come with an RSVP. Get back to me on this. And the contrast is that in the deontic cases, there's an expectation. In the non-deontic cases, the heartfelt cases, there can't be an expectation by definition. There's just the hope and the invitation and the opening. So a good example of this is the contrast between guilt and remorse. Now, the first time you hear this, it's natural to think, well, aren't guilt and remorse the same thing? Well, it may be the case that the usage of the words guilt and remorse are for the same thing, but it turns out that that's not true, and I'll be able to demonstrate that to you in just a moment. But what matters is the psychology of it. They're two different psychological states. Guilt is an attitude of the will, remorse is an attitude of the heart. Why? Well, guilt involves an acknowledgement of culpable wrongdoing, responsibility for injury, where injury is not like, a sports injury. Injury is something on the basis of which you could have a tort claim. You could claim damages. Okay. So it's about wronging another person, and it's a way of taking responsibility for it. So guilt doesn't itself necessarily, you can have unspoken guilt, but guilt bids to be acknowledged. The natural expression of guilt is to confess and to take responsibility. Remorse, by contrast, involves sorrow for the pain or suffering that one has perhaps culpably caused, though that turns out not to be necessary. Where sorrow is, and these are quotes from the Oxford English Dictionary, mental distress caused by loss, deep sadness, grief, being heartsick. So I think you can see the difference here. And I'll give an example to illustrate it. Guilt is the sense that one has violated a justified demand or requirement and must take responsibility for that. So it's all on the will side. Its focus is what one did and on taking responsibility for that, setting one's will, resolving for the future not to do it again, and trying to assure the other person that that's the case. Now, remorse, I say unlike agent regret. There's a agent regret is a term in the philosophical literature for the same thing that I'm using remorse to refer to. It may involve guilt, but it doesn't have to. And even if it does involve guilt, it adds crucially sorrow or sadness for the pain and suffering one has caused. It involves a heartfelt care or concern for the injured person. So remorse is an attitude of the heart. Attitudes of the heart mediate heartfelt relating, just as deontic reactive attitudes mediate mutually accountable relating. Now, let me give you an example so you can see the difference between guilt and remorse. Um, I talk about this in the book. This is the case of a guy named Richard Boothman, who works as a lawyer for the University of Michigan hospitals. He's worked there for a good long time now. When he came in, his job was to deal with malpractice cases and to try to reduce the university's or the hospital's exposure to financial risk, trying to cut losses. And typically, the way lawyers would do this is to talk to victims or families of victims of alleged malpractice and say, look, you could try to fight us in court, but there's no way you're going to win. We have this huge army of lawyers. They're very well trained, and we've got the resources, the University of Michigan hospitals that we can bring, and you don't have that. So can't we make a deal? Now, this was pretty much common practice. There are many problems with this. Surprisingly, ultimately, it led to much more expense for the hospitals than what they ended up doing. But most important for our purposes, it did nothing at all to help with the heart problem that both the victims and their families and the doctors and the hospital staff were feeling. So suppose you're a doctor and someone dies on your operating table. You feel awful about it. And suppose you're convinced there's nothing else you could have done. There's no culpable wrongdoing. You may feel guilt, but you know that it's not justified guilt. Still, you're heartsick and you feel for the family of the victim. So this is what's called moral injury. It happens in war all the time. Uh, my wife and I are right now watching a documentary about Vietnam, and all these American soldiers who are, you know, doing things that, well, there's pain and suffering all around, and they come back. They came back, and with terrible problems of mental illness, drug use, and so on. And this has happened in all the various wars that the U.S. has been in since as well. The point is that you get these heart wounds, um, and something needs to address that. And there's nothing, justice can't address that. It's only love that can heal a broken heart. So let me go back to the Boothman example, the University of Michigan hospitals. There was this guy named Ahmed, an Arab American from the Detroit area, who came in to the University of Michigan hospitals in Ann Arbor, and he was having various complaints, and they took him in and they worked with him and on him and tried to figure out what was wrong with him, and he died, uh, despite everything they did. Uh, the doctors felt terrible about it. Obviously, the family was irate and grief-stricken. Uh, what to do? Well, what Boothman recommended that they do, and this is now the standard policy, is that the medical staff meet with the family, if the family is willing to do that, and simply say what happened, hold themselves accountable, but also show how they felt. So what happened in this case was that the family came in. Initially, they were very angry. People were throwing things. The lawyer said, calm down. It's really rare for hospitals to even meet with you, hear what they have to say. And so the doctors and the other medical staff described what happened with Ahmed. And after a while, they started to cry. Um, and you can probably predict what happened. The family, the crying disarmed the defenses of the family. They naturally started to cry also. So they were sharing grief. Um, and before long, they're in each other's arms. Uh, and initially, they're sharing grief. And then the family's showing the doctors and the other staff photographs of Ahmed when he was younger. And they're having a kind of celebration of Ahmed's life. Um, now, let, let's not suppose that that made everything completely better, but it addressed their heart wounds in a way that even the most just tort settlement couldn't. So justice doesn't go any way towards uh, heartfelt connection. Only love can what's the phrase? Heal a wounded heart. Okay. So again, back to the basic structure, both deontic and non-deontic reactive attitudes call for response. They all have an RSVP. But whereas deontic attitudes expect response, the non-deontic ones invite it without expectation. They open the heart to another heart in the hope that the other heart will be open in return. The response deontic reactive attitudes expect is reciprocal respect for legitimate expectation. So mutual accountability always involves a respectful demand for respect. The response that non-deontic attitudes of the heart invite is a reciprocal attitude of the heart. So parenthetically, this is why there could never be a justified expectation or an obligation to have an attitude of the heart like love or remorse. Now, I find this is a point that people resist initially, because of course, like for example, when we in the marriage ceremony, we promise to love one another. So it looks like when you promise, you undertake an obligation. So you must be under an obligation to love one another. What I'm saying is that you can't have an obligation to have the attitude of love. You can have an obligation to do all kinds of things that try to keep that attitude alive or to be loving to the other person, to take care of them, but you can't promise to care for them in the sense of having the attitude of heartfelt concern. And the reason is anything you can be obligated to do, you can do simply out of respect for the obligation and for the other person that obligation expresses. This is a point that Immanuel Kant famously made under what he called the fact of reason in the Critique of Practical Reason. But it's impossible to be moved to love by out of respect. So if there were an obligation to love, then the way to recognize that would be to respect that obligation. But respect can't magically be changed into love. Sadly, a very hard one, hard-earned message for me in my life, I have to say. Okay. So attitudes of the heart are second personal. They open the heart to another heart, uh, inviting the other to be open in return. Now, what do I mean by heart? Well, I suspect. So early on in the book, I say, why do philosophers not write about the heart? At least analytical philosophers. And I think part of the reason is that heart's a metaphor. And analytic philosophers are very skeptical of metaphors. They want to know what the cash value is of this idea. But I think we all kind of know what heart is. Let's call it a cluster or a syndrome of linked emotional susceptibilities. So if I love you, then I'm inclined to uh, fear things on your behalf, to support you in various ways, to feel grief if you die, to feel sadness if something saddens you, and so on. So it's this kind of reciprocal uh, susceptibility or vulnerability to one another. It's also a form of attachment. So these are emotions we can be said to feel in our hearts and in a heartfelt way. And I think, it's pretty obvious that the language runs throughout our lives. And actually, if you look back in like ancient Greek texts, also heart is used in a similar way. Also, ancient Chinese texts as well, come to think of it. Okay, so this goes back to, I was saying, maybe you think that even if I could convince you that guilt and remorse are different psychological attitudes, don't we use the word guilt and remorse in the same ways? So here's the only experimental evidence I've ever provided for any claim in anything I've ever written. Uh, Google hits. So if now I can't promise you that you'll get these same results today because Google's a moving target. Um, and I was teaching a course in the fall, and one of my students, I said, I was inviting them all to do this, and one of them did it right there in the class, and he said, "Well, gee, I'm not seeing anything like this." And I said, "Did you put quotation marks around uh, heartfelt grief, for example?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." So then he got something close to this. Now, look at the difference here between heartfelt guilt and heartfelt remorse. So, heartfelt remorse is a natural idea, if I'm right. We feel remorse in our hearts. Heartfelt guilt is something like an oxymoron because guilt is not an attitude you feel in your heart. It's an attitude you feel with your will in taking responsibility, acknowledging what one did, and setting oneself to act differently in the future. Okay. And then you can see that displayed throughout all the rest of the attitudes of the heart and attitudes of the will. Um, yeah, so in a way, I've already made this point before, but let me just repeat it for emphasis. So, love the attitude, um, I'm saying, is an attitude of the heart, and so you can't ever have an obligation to feel it. But you can have an obligation to do things in the neighborhood of feeling it. That is, to try to keep love alive or to be careful not to um, uh, trifle with the other's heart. Al Green, the great blues and uh, roots rock uh, singer in the United States, has a wonderful song called Take Good Care of My Heart. So we can be careful with each other's hearts and we can be obligated to be careful with one another's hearts, but we can't be obligated to have the attitude of love. Okay, this is a list of the contents of the book. Um, Let me just pause a little bit over some of these. Um, yeah, after an introductory chapter, in chapter 2, I have a reading of a couple of speeches. One by Frederick Douglass that you may know, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and a second by James Baldwin debating William F. Buckley at the time. This is in 1965. I was a Yale undergraduate at the time. William Buckley was a major figure. I mean, he'd graduated in the 50s, but a major sort of conservative voice on campus remains, even though he's been dead a while. There's the William F. Buckley Society at Yale and so on. So Baldwin and William F. Buckley are debating the question before the Cambridge Union in England, Cambridge University in England, um, resolved that the American dream has been at the expense of the American Negro, with Baldwin taking the affirmative and Buckley taking the negative. Now, the reason I talk about these two speeches is because they illustrate this distinction. Douglas's What to the Slave is the Fourth of July holds its audience accountable for chattel slavery. Basically, he makes an argument. He says, makes two arguments. One is, look, uh, your forefathers, and he says you're saying, it's you guys. It's not my Fourth of July, it's your Fourth of July. Your forefathers sacrificed themselves so that you could have freedom. And so you would be free riding on their efforts if you didn't assume the obligation to extend freedom to all Americans, as indeed the Declaration of Independence and the um, Constitution require. So it's about mutual accountability, involves attitudes of the will. The Baldwin is really quite different. Baldwin uh, is manifesting for the audience the expense of chattel slavery and its legacy institutions, white supremacy. There's one point in particular where he says, it's not just, or even not so much, the daily indignities that one is subjected to in other forms of discrimination. There comes a time, he says, when you think that down the road a little bit and you imagine your nephew or your niece and you think it's not going to be any better for them. And you can see the profound sadness in his face. So, what he's about is showing the cost, the emotional, heartfelt cost of white supremacy. And I actually have, you can see this on YouTube on the web. If we have time later, maybe in the Q&A, I have four little vignettes from that I might show you if there's interest. Um, so he's bearing his heart, and the response is that the audience receives his heartfelt expression and responds with a heartfelt expression. So at the end of the debate, or of his speech, really, and he does, massively defeat Buckley in the debate. Um, he gets this really heartfelt applause. Okay, so uh, you can see the other chapters there. Let me just mention two. One is concerns gratitude, and I'm going to say a little bit about why gratitude's an attitude of the heart. But I also want to mention the last chapter, respect and love in reparations and repair for chattel slavery and its legacy. So typically, when we talk about reparations, uh, we have a kind of tort law model. Uh, what's a just way of compensating people for the injuries that uh, their forefathers and foremothers experienced, and the continuing effects of that today? Okay, so the question is a question of justice. But that does nothing to address the heart wounds. Um, so even if a perfectly just compensation, or even if white supremacy were just overcome within the next generation, for example, you know, impossible to imagine, but suppose it were, that would do nothing to address the way people feel uh, in their hearts. And so I talk about that as a problem of repair, and talk about ways of trying to address that. So I just mentioned this wonderful documentary it's on Netflix actually. It's called Turning Point, Vietnam. It just came up on Netflix in the last week. Um, so I was at Yale during the Vietnam War. And I remember after I graduated, remember the summer of 1968, living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and trying to figure out what was I going to do with the draft. The draft was changing. Initially, I was going to graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh, and uh, I thought I'd be deferrable because there were student deferments at that point. But that changed in the month of June, 1968. And so, still, even if there weren't draft deferments for being a student, teachers could get deferred. So I wrote to the University of Pittsburgh. I said, it's very nice that you've offered me this fellowship, but could you make me a teaching assistant so I could get deferred? And then that went away. Ultimately, I sort of convinced myself that I was against all war. I wasn't against all war. I was against that war. Um, and that wasn't, ultimately, I was able to get out actually because of an eye condition I have that's called a strabismus, which in some ways lies behind my philosophical ideas because it makes eye contact difficult, and I couldn't receive this. It couldn't be in the second person standpoint with people at a distance. So I started to think about that. Anyway, I remember I was very cocksure of my view that this war was completely unjustifiable. I still believe that. But more importantly, I kind of looked down my nose at those Americans who went to fight in the war, thinking that, you know, they were morally corrupt in some way. And I remember seeing this would have been in early 70s, a film called The Deer Hunter about uh, Vietnam vets coming back to the Pittsburgh area, working in the Clairton Works of the United States still. If you haven't seen the film, I really recommend it. It's really a great film. Christopher Walken and Robert De Niro and others, and feeling utter shame uh, that for having felt this way, and feeling for the first time the enormity of the emotional cost. Never mind for the Vietnamese. I mean, that was incalculably greater. But for the American GIs who went to fight in Vietnam. Now, here's why am I telling you about this in relation to this last chapter? Here's why. Uh, if you lived during that time, you realized that the country was split right down the middle about the Vietnam War. And a lot of our current splits have to do with things that came about during that time, reactions to liberation movements, reactions to the student unrest. Um, and I've always said since then, I think it's still true, that every election, perhaps with the exception of Obama, have been about the Vietnam War, or not so much about the war itself. That's the point I'm about to make, but about the divisions that came about in this country during the Vietnam conflict and during Black Power and other forms of liberation in this country. Um, but here's an amazing thing. There's not that much argument about the Vietnam War itself now. Why is that? I believe a lot of it has to do with the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., which, if you haven't seen it, I really invite you to go and see it. You can't have the same experience, say, that I had or people in my generation had when you go and you see people looking for their loved ones and trying to find their names on this really stark, very impressive, but not in the normal way, understated um, memorial, which was designed, by the way, by Maya Lin, who's a Yale undergraduate. And I remember Richard Broadhead, a classmate of mine who then became the dean of Yale College, saying to students who were coming in the class of 2006 that she actually designed this memorial for the first time in Commons in the dining hall with mashed potatoes. So I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's starts very not so tall on both sides, and then goes towards the middle. And what that's symbolizing is the U.S. involvement. So it starts very small events, and then it gets towards height in 1967, and then it goes in the early years of the Nixon administration. Okay, so seeing that memorial did a lot, I think, to heal a lot of the heart wounds coming out of the Vietnam War for American GIs and their families. Um, and so it's just remarkable that despite the sharp divisions that exist today, it's not arguments about the Vietnam War. To the contrary, our president, it was, an opponent of the war, or at least didn't want to go himself. But he certainly has never said that we should have been in Vietnam and that was a just fight. To the contrary. So my point is that being able to process emotionally the heart wounds through some kind of vivid presentation in a memorial can go a long way. So then the challenge would be, well, what can we imagine that would do similar emotional work with the heart wounds of chattel slavery and white supremacy? Okay. So love is what I call the central attitude of the heart. All attitudes of the heart are involved forms of love. They all involve an opening, and they also involve a desire to be together in one another's presence. I have a chapter called Being With. So we just go back here. Yeah, Heartfelt Being With, chapter 8, um, and involving heartfelt, emotional, affective sharing. Now, just finally here, gratitude's an attitude of the heart. It's an attitude of heartfelt appreciation and thankfulness to perhaps presupposed benefactor. And I look at a couple of other theories. Kant has this theory that involves honoring a person because of a benefit, and and it involves some feeling of respect and an obligation. Adam Smith says that what gratitude is chiefly intent upon is not only to make the benefactor feel pleasure in his turn, but to make him feel pleased with that conduct and to satisfy him that the person upon whom he bestowed his good offices was not unworthy of them. Now, I'm not talking here about the debt of gratitude. I'm talking about the attitude of gratitude. And what neither of these accounts can explain, nor can any other account that I know of, except the one I'm offering, explain, is why gratitude is so central to human flourishing. So there's this phenomenon of gratitude diaries, and there's just all this experimental work that if you uh, have moments of gratitude and acknowledge your gratitude and express it, or even just have gratitude diaries, things I'm grateful for, where that means not just what you're pleased about or happy. There's a different feeling of being fortunate that something happened, but being grateful for it involves an opening of one's heart and a heartfelt thanking. Um, and it's no surprise that we know that personal connection, personal relationship, attachment is extremely important to uh, well-being and psychic health, and has a lot to do with how long one lives. And it's just not surprising then that gratitude would play a role in that if gratitude is, as I say, an attitude of the heart. So finally, here's a table just to summarize. So we've got under attitudes, we got two kinds of attitudes, the deontic ones. These are the Straussonian reactive attitudes, and then they're the non-deontic attitudes of the heart. So uh, all of these are second personal. They all involve an implicit address, and they all involve an implicit RSVP, but they have different modes of response. So with the deontic examples, the mode of response is expectation. So if you feel resentment, You expect of the other person, not just expect that the other person, but expect of the other person that they will acknowledge the wrong and apologize for it and try to compensate for it. In the case of the attitude of the heart, though, uh, expectation, you can't expect the other person to open their heart. You can only hope for that. And hope is actually another attitude of the heart. Not hoping that, but hoping of someone, having your hopes pinned on someone. The response to fulfillment in the case of the Deontic ones is nothing. If somebody does what they're obligated to do, gratitude doesn't make sense. But if they open their heart to you in response to your opening your heart to them, then you feel joy, gladness, and gratitude. Response to the frustration of the attitude, well, in the case of the deontic attitudes, it's blame and resentment. In the case of the attitudes of the heart, it's sadness. Um, and I actually can't see what else I've got written there because I can't move you guys around. So I have one of, I think it's in my screen, it's Rusty's tile that's obscuring. You probably can't see it. Can you see it, Rusty?
Yes, I can see the whole screen. Is there a square you want me to point
So
out?
sadness slash
Sadness slash hurt.
hurt. Thank you very much. Hurt feelings. Great. Okay. So all reactive attitudes call for reciprocation. They all come with an RSVP. Deontic, deontic reactive attitudes expect respect. Attitudes of the heart invite reciprocating heartfelt attitudes. Okay. So this is James Baldwin in the 1965 debate with William F. Buckley, and see if you can see what I am claiming to see in this.
This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is again not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton and I carried it to market. And I built the railroad under someone else's whip for nothing. I am stating very simply.
Oops, sorry.
Now, I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama, cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children. I'm sure that, he likes to get drunk. He's, after all, one's got to assume, and he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is gaslit. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse. Now, I suggest that of all the terrible things,
Sorry.
it is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until the moment comes when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
Tremendously moving moment now, the whole of the Union standing and applauding this magnificent speech of James Baldwin. Never seen this happen before in the Union in all the years that I have known it.
Perhaps that gives you some sense of what I found so moving. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Darwall. I hope that inspires our audience.